Welcome. This is Paul talking about some Panhard engines. And I wanted to talk about how to check and adjust your crankshaft end play. Crankshaft end play is important so that you don't get too much wear on your bearings, wear out the rear main seal that could cause it to leak if it walks back and forth too much. Panhards are only using the two front and rear bearings for your end play. They don't have a separate thrust bearing like a lot of other engines. It doesn't have a lot of pressure trying to move the crankshaft forward or back. What pressure it does have is from you pushing on the clutch, and that's going to push the throwout bearing onto the pressure plate, which pushes on the flywheel, and the crankcase has to keep so that it doesn't move back and forth. Um, the clutch isn't super heavy on this Panhard, so you don't have a lot there. And then they made the front valve train area, the camshaft gear, and the crankshaft gear are these double bevel cut gears. So when you have the two gears riding on this, there's no thrust forward or back. It's pretty well centralized and doesn't have a lot of pressure trying to move your crankshaft axially against the thrust surfaces. So we've got a bearing, and that bearing is pressed into this rear housing. It's a really light press, but it's an interference fit. You heat this up, obviously, before you put the seal in, so you don't get the seal too hot. But you heat this outer housing, and then you can pretty much drop this bearing in there. The deal is you adjust your end play with the shim. So you have different thicknesses of shims that you can put in here and then have your bearing installed, install this, and then check the end play. So it's not real convenient to do that all the time. So I worked on a lot of Corvettes, and working on those, the rear spindles, I'm talking the older C2 Corvettes and that you had to set up the bearing end play on the rear spindles. And to do that, you'd have to take the bearing on and off. Or guys working on rear differentials, if you had shims underneath your pinion bearing, they'd usually make up a pinion or have the special factory tools to set it up and find out what size shims you need. So I went ahead and I made up this end play adjusting tool. I went ahead and put this on the lathe and cut this out so my bearing fits in there. These are all pretty much a standard distance and thickness between the face and where the bearing seats. So what I do is I take my shim I removed from the engine. Then I'm going to take my bearing and it just pushes in there as opposed to having to press it in. Then I can take, this is the oil feed hole at the bottom here. It's going to line up with the one here. And then you can just barely get this on. If you're assembling it, sometimes you need to heat this up a little bit to get the bearing large enough to go over the crankshaft. It can be a tight fit. And then this should fit over the top of here if I get it lined up right. There we go. And snapped in. I did drill these out just a little bit larger so it's an easier fit going together. So then I take a few of the nuts, get them started on here, and I'm just going to seat this front housing in, I call this the front housing, this rear housing plate onto the case. So just put a few of these guys, doesn't really matter where they go, I want to just get them on there tight. Now they do use a sealer on this when you're going together. They don't use a gasket, but they're going to use a sealer. I've used anaerobic sealer. Anaerobic sealer doesn't usually take up very much space in there, and it's not going to space it out and throw your end play off. So that's going to use that's what they use when they put cases together and things like that. Torque on these, I'd have to look it up, but they're probably around 20-25 foot-pounds, and I'm going to call that good. So the service manual is going to tell you to use a special tool to push this crankshaft forward and back so that you can measure it and see how much play you have. I have one of the tools. This is the tool for removing this housing. It's a puller. I got this from John Peterson. He is the president of the USA Panhard Club. And I went to Reno to his house a couple times, bought some parts from him, and he was gracious enough to give me this tool. So I have this tool that will push on the crankshaft, but there is another tool that I don't have. I could make one that you want to be able to pull the crankshaft towards you to be able to measure what you got going on in thousandths. So let me tighten this down a little bit. So instead of that, I went ahead and mounted a tool on the back side of this, which I'll show you in a second when I turn it around, so that I can push the crankshaft the other direction. I just took one of these hub pullers and put a big old washer there, put a plate across there, and I happen to have a little bearing that I set in there so you can still turn the crankshaft, and I can push the crankshaft that way to do my measurements. To properly do this, you first should tighten this down and seat your bearing, actually seat the crankshaft into your bearing all the way. And they say to heat that up a little bit while you're doing it. I have already done that with this crankshaft. It is able to go to the rear position without me having to heat it up again. So I made a small adapter here for adjusting, or not adjusting, checking the end play. And it is by no means the super tool, because when I built it, I didn't have this guy in the way, so I could read the dial really easily. But hey, I can turn it and get it set up that way. So the procedure in the book, let me see if I have the book over here. I thought I left it open. Yeah. So this is the Panhard manual that I have. It's actually for a PL17. That's the engine that's in this. Shop manual. It's a hardbound manual. And it's got great drawings in it of the oil passages of the system. There it is in color even. The drawings are in French, but the rest of the manual is in English. I'm working on my French. I haven't got it down yet, but I can recognize some things. And here's the procedure here, and I'll run through it a little bit. Okay. So let me see if this is where you can see it. Yeah, look, it's looking pretty good right there. All right, so let me get a wrench here. They want you to go ahead with this one in the back loose, which it is. They want you to tighten this guy down a little bit and get your crankshaft moved to the rear. And they say stop when you can't turn your crankshaft. And I am right there. I'm pulling on the connecting rod over here with my left hand. So that when I loosen it a little bit, my crankshaft comes back there. Now I can turn it fairly easy right about there. And that's where you set your dial indicator to 0. So I'm going to flip this around, and you probably can't see it very well, but my dial indicator's on 0 right there. So then what you do is you take the rear one and you go ahead and tighten that up until you can't turn the crankshaft. And I am about there. And then back it off. and then it's going to be reading your clearance. I have about 2,000, so I'm going to do that again. It only came up 2. Last time I checked it, it was 3. So seat it to the rear and see if you can turn it. Right here. There we go. All right, there. All right, can't turn it. And we're at 0. Give it a little tap a little bit. Back this off. My crankshaft turned and messed me all up. So let me get this in a little bit different position here. There we go. So there I backed it off. There I'm going to go 0. Here I'm going to tighten it down. And then I'll go back to where I can turn it. And yeah, we're about 4 or 5 thousandths right in that range. About 3 to 4 thousandths in that range. So if it is not the proper end play, that's when you can take it apart, try a different shim. The shim I have in it is about 20 thousandths, if you want to go 20 thousandths, or a little less than half a millimeter. I don't remember exactly. I'd have to get it out and mic it. And you can get different shims and put them in there. Obviously, I would not be using the same rear housing. That's just my test housing. I would be using a different housing. You can check the clearance, the difference between here and here, especially if you have a granite measuring table, and make sure it's the same as the one that I was using as a test one. All right, so go ahead and put comments down in there. I am learning on this thing. That's the way I do it. I could modify this tool and make it so I could push and pull instead of using the back one, but that's the way I had it set up. If you like these videos, I'll continue making some more. Go ahead and put it in the comments, or subscribe, or click like, or something like that. I'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot.